Hello everyone and welcome to Game 2 of the 2019 World Fischer Random Championship Finals. It's Wesley Sona with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen. The setup is the same, so basically the rook's gambit declined, as someone conveniently said in the comment section, but as the setup is pretty much similar to classical chess, with the queens and rooks having switched places, and this rook and knight are differently placed. But other than that, some of the ideas that work in normal chess will work here. So without further ado, after a tough game in round 1 that ended in a draw, now let's see how they played out the game 2. Wesley opens with d4, and now we... What? Sorry about that. That almost never happens. No, that never happens. I've never seen that. But luckily we can just continue it now. So d4 and now b6, not d5 like we had a similar in the previous game. So knight to g3 by Wesley and bishop to a6 by Magnus. Now it's already a weird move to face, especially since well, now you can't go for e4, which you kind of want as you prepared with knight to g3 because of bishop captures on f1. Maybe you can play it, but you've never actually seen this, so you don't want to overcalculate it. But I saw that Leach has posted on Twitter that they actually have a Fischer Random or Chess 960 database, and this position has been reached 2 times. So it is still not a new position as of move 2, even though it's Fischer Random. So very exciting times that we are living in. b3. Preparing c4, and now e6 by Magnus. We have c4 now blocking this diagonal, and d5 by Magnus. With e3 now strengthening the c4 square, bishop to e7, and now knight to c3. So nicely continuing development, knight to g6, maybe preparing to castle, bishop to d3, and here Magnus just castles. We have castles by Wesley and knight to d7. Wesley trades once on d5, we have c captures on d5, now bishop captures on d3 first, rook captures, and e captures on d5. And here Wesley goes for knight to f5. And it makes sense if you can eliminate black's dark square bishop and make use of your own. For example, this diagonal is free for grabs, then it should be very nice. Magnus goes rook f to e8, he puts a rook on a semi-open e-file, maybe prepares bishop to f8 if he doesn't want to trade, but Wesley doesn't even allow it. He plays knight captures on e7, rook captures, and now b4, expanding further on the queen side, preparing a4. We have knight to f6, and now b5, stifling white's development on the queen side, so Magnus has to do something. c6 is played, and now a4. We have h5 by Magnus, and now h3. So both players create some breathing space for the king, and queen to c8. Magnus now looks for ways to bring the queen into the game, controlling some squares on the king side, but also with ideas of maybe just, well, not capturing at the moment, but if something opens up on the c file, it does help to have your queen on this file. Also, rook to c7 could be an idea. So b captures on c6 by Wesley, and now rook to e6 by Magnus. He will transfer this rook over to the c file. We have f3, taking away some very nice squares from Carlsen's knights, and also preparing e4. We have rook captures on c6, and now e4 as planned. We have d captures on e4, f captures on e4, and now Wesley has a really strong center here. If he's able to consolidate, put rooks behind those 2 pawns, get the queen into the game, develop the pieces, he should be excellent here if he can just start pushing the pass d pawn, for example. But Magnus doesn't allow it. He goes knight to e5. Now, of course, you cannot trade because the rook on d3 is undefended, so rook back to e3 by Wesley, and now knight to c4 by Magnus. Going after the rook on e3, we have rook e back to f3. Now, this knight cannot move. e5 is a threat. After the knight moves, rook captures on f7 will be an idea. But here, Magnus decides to clear the board of the 2 central pawns and allow Wesley an incredible attack. So we have rook captures on d4. Knight to d5 by Wesley, now threatening everything, threatening to capture the rook on d4, threatening knight e7, check to fork the king and the queen. If the knight captures, then rook captures on f7 is an idea. It's just crazy stuff. So here, Magnus plays rook captures on e4. It gets the rook out of harm's way and also guards e7, so you don't have knight to e7. But now, Wesley has a lot of things going for him. There's a quadruple attack on the f6 square. So first, let's see what happens if you trade. Let's say if knight captures with check, rook captures, you could go rook captures, g captures, and now let's say queen captures. Seems like a very nice attack, but Magnus is in time to defend with queen to e6, offering a queen trade, guarding the f7 pawn. So here, let's say queen g5 check, queen g6 check, and the black defends. Everything ends the variation being up a pawn. So not something Wesley is interested in doing. Capturing with the rook runs into pretty much the same stuff. Rook captures, now you can play knight captures with check, captures, captures, and you go into the same line. So here Wesley played the most awesome move. He played bishop to h6, which offers a lot of thinking space for Magnus, because he has to be careful. For example, one nice example is if you move the knight, you're getting checkmated. Queen captures on g7 is mate. On the other hand, if you just capture the bishop, then you no longer guard the f6 square, so now it's just knight captures on f6 check, and well, you just lose material here. Either you're going to lose this rook, or you have to give up this rook, and then there's just triple attack against the f7 pawn. You would be completely losing here. So, after this bishop to h6 move, Magnus plays a knight to e8. He gets the knight away, although there is no queen g7 mate, as the knight here covers the g7 square. And here, Wesley could capture on f7. This is what Magnus was hoping for, so he could snap the bishop on h6, and here you're just, you've lost the bishop and you don't have an attack, you don't have any good moves. If rook f8 check, you just move the king, it's not a problem. So, after this knight to e8 move, Wesley played bishop captures on g7. He immediately played this, and it's 18 moves for Wesley and 21 minutes on the clock for Magnus. So, what do you do here? Here, Magnus played the very calm knight to d2, and it's just crazy. Everything is, hanging, rook captures on f7, is hanging, rook is coming to g3, this could happen, and Magnus just calmly plays knight to d2, which wins material, as both of the rooks are under attack. And it immediately goes against the rook g3 idea, because if rook g3, threatening some nice discoveries, just knight captures on f1. And now, all of Carlsen's pieces are on light squares, and you don't have a good discovery here because, well, the knight will just capture the rook if you try a discovery. Bishop h6 check, knight captures, and you don't even have a nice mate because the knight still covers the g7 square. So here, after knight to d2, Wesley played rook captures on f7. He sacrificed the exchange. We have knight captures on f1, and now rook to f8 check. We have king to h7, and now Wesley retreats with the bishop to e5. And here, someone also posted this in the comments, Wesley's heart rate was 159, so he was really in the moment, and Carlsen has to decide, does he have time for rook to c1, and can he allow rook to h8 check? What happens after rook to h8 check? Is he getting mated, or what is happening here? So here, Carlsen took some 10 minutes to decide what to play, and in the end, he played rook to c1. He attacked Wesley's queen, and also is threatening some nasty discoveries of his own. So Wesley very quickly replied with rook to h8 check. It is the main line, and it is the best line for white. So here we have king to g6 by Magnus, and now knight to e7 check, forking the king and the queen. We reach the position from the thumbnail, and what can Magnus do now? Well, he can go king to f7 or king to g5. If king g5, it would go very bad for him. Rook g8 check, you have to move, king h4, and now bishop to f6 check. You don't have any more moves. You have to capture the bishop, and now queen captures on f6 will be mate. The king has nowhere to go. The rook controls the entire g file, and you cannot block check. So after knight e7 check, Magnus goes for king to f7, and now, again, what can Wesley do? Wesley could trade down everything. For example, if he trades down, knight captures, rook captures, we have captures on a1, captures on a4 now, attacking the bishop here. So if king captures, knight, rook captures bishop. But now white has rook h7 check, king g6, and now rook captures on a7, defending the bishop from a7. Now we could trade here, captures, captures, and after the knight moves, we reach this position. position where it's pretty equal, 2 points each. 2 knights against the bishop and the knight, but should be a draw. So this is one option for Wesley, knight captures, but Wesley continues the attack with rook to h7 check. Also, by doing this, he defends his knight as the king was ready to just capture it. We have king to e6 by Magnus. King f8 is also fine. King to e6, and now Wesley doesn't have a way of continuing the attack, although it seems like he should have. With so many pieces on the board and Carlsen's king still on e6, there actually isn't a good way to continue the attack. There just isn't. If queen a2 check, you can just block it. Queen to c4, the rook covers this, so nothing going on there. So he goes for the trade. Knight captures on c8. We have rook captures on a1 by Magnus. Bishop captures on a1, and now knight back to g3. And here, rook captures on a7. He captures yet another pawn, and Wesley is now up a pawn. So what's going on here? We have knight to f5. Magnus goes back with the knight. You don't win a piece by rook e1 check because, well, just king f2 attacks the knight, so it's basically a trade. So first Magnus moves it, now threatens rook e1, but Wesley just moves the bishop all the way to h8. It looks like a funny square to put your bishop, but, you know, if it works, it works. Nicely slices the board in half. It's a very powerful piece. And for the moment, black has no way of attacking it, so it's just a good piece. And next move, Wesley is ready to pick up the b6 pawn as well. So here, Magnus has to decide what to do. Probably rook c4 or rook to e1 check followed by rook to c1 attacking the knight here. He has to allow the capture of this pawn here, but Magnus decided to play actively and he played rook to e2. Probably with ideas of just maybe knight to h4, picking off the g2 pawn or creating some threats. But the rook to e2 is a serious blunder. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the best move for Wesley in this position while I give you a couple of seconds. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding such a nice winning idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the knight controls the e7 square, which is what's preventing rook to e7. So basically what Wesley did here is he just decided to dislodge the knight from f5, which defends the e7 square. And he played g4. So congratulations to everyone who found it. Seems like an odd move for Magnus to miss, but Wesley really made him calculate a lot. He tired him down, and here even the great Magnus is able to make a mistake like this. So h captures on g4, h captures, and now you have to either lose the knight or move the knight and allow rook to e7. Magnus moved it, knight to e3, and now Wesley just played rook to e7 check. We have king to d5, and now rook captures on e8. Wesley happily grabbed a piece, and here you don't really have any compensation for it. It's not just that you're down a piece, you're down a piece and a pawn. So here Carlsen went for rook to g2 check, king h1, and now rook captures on g4, offering yet another piece. Well, a trade basically for rook check and picking up the bishop. So Wesley decided whether to pick it up right away or to go for knight captures on b6 first, but he was also he didn't want to overcomplicate it. He just went into a line that he knew that he could win. So he played rook captures on e3. We have rook captures on h4, king g2, and rook captures on h8, attacking the knight here. But now knight captures on b6 with check, king c5, and now rook to b3. So here we have a position where it's a rook, knight, and pawn against a rook. If Wesley did not have this pawn, if it was just a rook and a knight against a rook and king, then Magnus would be able to draw this. But unless it was some really crazy position that was winning by force, but with the pawn, it should definitely be winning. So here Magnus will try everything in his power to stop Wesley from winning. Maybe he can draw, maybe he can get out through the 50 move rule, maybe he can get a stalemate, maybe Wesley will not play the absolute best move, so he will try everything. So first he has to decide how to get his king over here to try and stop the passed pawn, and how to get maybe the white king from not reaching the action. So one idea is rook h7, if you just stop the pawn from behind, but here white would have rook b5 check, king c6, and now knight to d5, just putting the knight behind the pawn. So, for example, after rook a7, you would have knight b4 check, and after the king moves, now you push a5, and here the pawn and the knight are creating a nice wall, so the black king cannot reach it, and then you just move the rook, go behind with the rook, or just calmly start bringing your king into the game. That's one way how you win it. So, after rook b3, Magnus doesn't like rook h7, he goes rook to h4. maybe with ideas of rook to b4. If he can trade rooks and somehow force, somehow attack the knight and the pawn simultaneously, then he can draw this game. But we have a5 here is probably the most precise by Wesley, but he decided to go for rook to b5, and he gave Magnus some chances. We have king to c6, rook to b1 now, as you want to start pushing your pawn at some point, and now rook to h5 by Magnus, not allowing a5. So here Wesley repeats knight c4, and Magnus repeats rook to h4. We have knight back to b6, and Magnus happily repeats rook to h5. He's down a piece. He definitely wouldn't mind the draw. Knight to c4, and Magnus repeats rook to h4. So if Wesley repeats one more time, it's a threefold repetition, but of course Wesley doesn't. Wesley goes back, knight b2. Now the a4 pawn is nicely protected, and now you can finally activate your rooks. Even if the rooks get traded, now it's winning for white, because even if the rooks are off the board, if you get, even the king gets here to attack the knight and pawn simultaneously, you just push the pawn, you give up the knight, and then the pawn queens. So king back to b6 by Magnus. There are no good discoveries here. And now Wesley starts bringing the king into the game. King g3. We have rook to d4, and now king f3. King to a5 by Magnus, and now king to e3. We have rook back to d8, not allowing the king to cross the d file, but now rook to h1. And here Wesley's heart rate was about 161, which is the highest anyone had in the championship so far. And as you should be, you're about to take down the world champion. Of course, you're excited. So rook to d5, not allowing any checks along the h file, and then now comes rook to h4. Here Wesley is planning rook to d4, block Carlsen's influence of the rook on the d file, and then just bringing his king deeper into the position. So rook to g5 by Magnus, you have to allow king d3, and now rook back to c5. Here Wesley just blocks Carlsen's rook, and now rook to h5. Of course, he doesn't want to trade. Rook c3, sorry, king to c2, and now rook to h3. Again, not allowing the king to enter the position, but rook c3. Rook back to h6, and now finally king to b3. We have rook to b6 check by Magnus, and now king a3. So now the king is safe here, there are no more checks, and now it's time to make more progress. We have rook to c6 by Magnus here, offering a whole rook, as if you capture it, of course, it's stalemate. The king has nowhere to go. So Wesley not interested in this. Wesley picked up the rook, and he went in front of the rook, but he placed it on c4, of course. He will not capture it. We have rook just goes back, rook to h6. And now rook to c5 with check. Now finally kicking the king away and making more progress. King b4. We have rook to h1 by Magnus, rook c6 check, king to a7, and now knight to c4. We have king b7 attacking the rook, rook b6 check, king to a7, and now we have rook to g6. Now making room for the king to enter the board. Rook to b1 check, and now king to a5. And here it's 6.5 minutes for Wesley and 5 minutes for Magnus. He will still try to somehow save this game. We have rook back to h1 by Magnus, rook to g7 check, king to b8, and now king to a6. Here we have rook to h4 by Magnus, attacking the knight and the pawn, but now rook to g8 check, and it was in this position that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game on move 72, and a brilliant victory for Wesley. So a brilliant start of the game, brilliant attack, and then brilliantly trading down into an endgame that he knew very much how to win without wasting very much time. So really, in this game, Magnus was definitely outclassed. So he resigns because now it's too simple of a win. Once the king moves, you're gonna go knight to b6, and now the pawn just marches forward. For example, if king to d6 or any other move you play, doesn't really matter. Let's say king d6. Now you just play rook to c8. You cut off the king. Next, you place the king on b7, and the pawn advances. There's nothing you can do here. Of course, Magnus could try a few more moves, but from this point on, from rook g8 check, it would just be silly to even try. Magnus knows this, and here he resigns. So Wesley takes the lead, and a win in the classical time format is 3 points. So Magnus is now down 3 points in the match, which is pretty huge. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. We'll see what happens tomorrow. 2 more classical games and a chance for Magnus to equalize. He started with a loss against Fabi. He was able to equalize that. We'll see what happens here. I would also like to thank Tony Mo at guitar and Nimrod Bass for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Fischer Fischer Random Championship, and well, you know, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and so on. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.